forward. But maybe just to get started, we've heard a bit about your backgrounds, but maybe like if you could give, if everyone can go really quick, like a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is like AI is the worst possible thing for the planet, and 5 is, it could be the future, like the tool that like brings a sustainable planet, whatever that means. Would love to know kind of like where you're at, and then like maybe like a sentence about why or an explanation. Maybe Kim, do you want to start?
Okay, great. No pressure. I think I'm sorry, I'm gonna be that person, a 3, right in the middle, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity for it to improve efficiencies and address like resource gaps that exist in a lot of sectors, but I think that there's a lot that's being done in kind of a wild, wild west way right now that could have some pretty severe long-term implications.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think also 3, and I think the reason is we are kind of at a crossroads right now. I think the amount of news articles, literature, things coming out about the climate impacts of AI, I think has been pretty recent. So I think there's a lot of opportunities still to change course, but I think the impact of it is not predetermined yet.
I would push for a 4, just kind of candidly from where we're working out with digital green, but just the possibility that exists there. And if there are enough other people calling out the injustices, the wrongness, and other organizations that are also pushing for good use cases of it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also a 4. I think at this moment, that's where I stand, but I'm also a bit of an optimist, and so I think I'm hopeful that that can like shift me a little bit further up the scale. I do think that AI is something that kind of reflects our values as humans, and it sort of can exacerbate a lot of the things that already existed in terms of injustices, in terms of the way that we extract resources, and so I think that's where my lower score or higher score comes from. But I think that, I don't know, I'm hopeful in us as humans and being able to maybe address some of these issues, and hopefully the severity of AI will really push us to rethink our value system.
Love that. Cool, thanks. So yeah, let's dive into the full discussion. Maybe Kim, I'll start it off with you. So your company, Flush, as we heard, it does a lot about data storytelling, and especially around making water and sanitation issues visible and compelling to audiences. That all being said, most of the people that are using an AI tool like ChatGPT have no idea that these systems consume like as much as they do. So I guess like the question I have for you is like, how do you think about making these hidden environmental costs visible? And along those lines, like what would effective storytelling around this issue look in ways that cut through the PR and instead like mobilize action?
Right. I think there's a couple levels. I think, to start with talking about like just awareness. So right now the culture of AI is definitely, like you kind of mentioned, Jasmine, like a reflection of like how we consume things as a culture. It's very extractive at the moment, and I don't think it's necessarily as thoughtful as it can be. So I think like on the individual side, and I'm not the person to do this because I am not a coder, even though I live in San Francisco, there's a lot of opportunity for people to build awareness trackers. Like in my dream life, there would be like an extension I could put on my web browser that actually like helps me calculate the water I use for all of the AI prompts that I put out in a day, so I can see how thirsty I am, right? And I can kind of bake that into my understanding of my water bill, or something like that, just so people are aware. But on the more institutional level, I think there's also just, generally speaking, the story around water specifically, that's really where my focus is like water in data, in AI. It's really quite nascent. We're starting to get numbers, but there's not a lot of understanding what that story is. Even, I do a lot of auditing in a lot of these data centers, so I've been to these data centers, I've seen their cooling centers, and the idea of measuring your water consumption is still new. We actually need to track that. They don't necessarily have ceilings on their water permit, so having that kind of story, I think it's understanding it not just at the individual level, but at institutional level in the organizations and the companies, having accountability for it, but also in regulatory agencies that are permitting for water consumption in different places. So I think when it comes to the story of AI and how it extracts from our environment, there's kind of a multi-level place where we're not filling the gaps right now, or we haven't yet. And I think that the story needs to come out more, like you mentioned, it's pretty new, of like having this conversation about the environmental impacts. But I think people need to start realizing, you know, that 100-word prompt you gave, or not 100-character prompt you give to AI, you know, that is a drop in a larger bucket, and understanding that larger system challenge. I could keep going, but I won't.
No, I love it, thanks, yeah. And like we've already told the panelists, if they have thoughts on a question, they're welcome to jump in. But maybe in that case, I'll turn to Eric, where, you know, like Kim's talking a lot about how it's important to, you know, visualize the costs in a way. But as you were even mentioning in your intro, I think it's equally as important to mention sort of like the ways that AI can actually be like an effective solution to environmental change. And I think Farmer Chat is a great example of this, as it navigates climate change with climate smart agricultural recommendations. So would you mind maybe first explaining what Farmer Chat is and how AI enables recommendations to be climate smart? And then additionally, like from your perspective, what types of use cases in the environmental sense is AI like best suited for to be particularly beneficial?
Yeah, definitely. So at Digital Green, we have this flagship tool called Farmer Chat. It's been around for about 2 years or so. Basically, when GPT-2 or 3, whenever OpenAI kind of came into their own a little bit ago. Overall, just for quick background, Digital Green as well, we've been around for about 20 years. We've always had a mission of bringing the latest and greatest technology in the world to specifically smallholder farmers in rural parts of Asia, Africa, and South America that tend to be left behind by kind of everybody in a lot of ways, but typically grow 80% of the world's food, both for themselves and their families and communities, as well as it's exported out to the countries, possibly even the rice that we had over there for dinner tonight. So those farmers are doing a lot on a small amount of land. They're trying to maximize productivity, and they're very creative. They've been doing it generally for generations, and we've always had to bring, like I said, that technology that exists in the world to them to bear, to make use of it in the same way that we make use of wonderful technology here in San Francisco otherwise. Our first technology 20 years ago was brace yourself video. It was basically video on smartphones. Actually, it wasn't even smartphones, because it was pre-smartphones. This was video projectors onto sheets on the side of buildings. And instead of farmers getting information from friends or neighbors, they would gather into a community group and watch this video about a practice that was relevant to them in their local area. And that worked far better than the previous version, which was effectively an extension agent coming to talk to a farmer once a month, maybe. We have those systems in most countries around the world. But if you're a farmer and you have pests today, you need an answer for that tomorrow, otherwise half your crop is gone and you will go hungry that season and you won't be able to export food. So fast forwarding to where we are today, Farmer Chat is the latest kind of leveraging the technology of the current moment, which of course is AI for all of us, for those farmers. And what it looks like now is a app on their smartphones, because a lot of these farmers do have smartphones. There's mobile phone connectivity. Some farmers have 2 or 3 phones in cases where they kind of play off telco networks depending on the best rate available at that given time. Very smart. But at its core, it's a chatbot, just like we all have used from all the big tech companies, but tailored, fine-tuned, or even in some cases with using a RAG pipeline of curated content to deliver specific information to them based on their location, based on their environment, based on their crop, and the questions they're asking, of course. So we are a tech nonprofit, so we're not a for-profit company, so we can insert our own kind of values and ethics into it. So we do have a climate bend to the suggestions and the advice that we give. We try to be realistic about what's actually available or possible for these farmers. In some cases, they might not have something like neem oil, which is much more organic and climate friendly than Roundup, in a sense, for pests. But we do try to give them the more cost-effective option, easier to procure, and then apply to their field option for that. So as far as what that looks like for them, I mean, all that information exists typically out there in the world, in various research centers. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Consultative Group on Agricultural Research, CGIAR, International Rice Research Institute, things like that. There's a ton of data on how to grow all these crops, but they're just not getting into the hands of those farmers. So AI, it turns out, is really good at synthesizing information. So if we put all of that world's smartest and most advanced agricultural research into all these crops that are climate smart, and then deliver that to the farmers, we found they're more likely to adopt those practices. We found rates as high as 60-70% of adoption after one conversation about a particular practice or a particular problem that they might have.
Cool, awesome. No, that's super like interesting how you've been able to like use AI for like such a great like tangible way to help people. And Jasmine, unlike Farmer Chat, a lot of AI companies aren't necessarily thinking about the benefits, especially as the cost can be disproportionate at times. And you know, I think like there are analogies for other types of environmental impacts, like with power outages, utility companies have regulatory obligations. If there's water contamination, there are environmental laws, but AI, it's a lot more murky. I know you have a background on utility regulation and energy policy. So I'd love to hear your take on kind of like what would meaningful accountability look like for AI's environmental impacts, and then like who do you think should be responsible for ensuring systems don't harm communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I think when it comes to energy, what more meaningful accountability would look like is a few things. One, I think it's more transparency into like what resources these tech companies and these data centers are actually using and how much. So going back to your comment about water, but I think it's some of the same with energy as well, where a lot of these contracts that the utilities company makes with the tech companies, we just don't really have any insight into like what those impacts will be and how much energy they're trying to procure. In addition to that, sometimes as well, you'll have energy or these tech companies working directly with energy providers, and not always does that go through regulation at the state utility level. And so that is completely bypassing that regulation, which also makes planning a lot harder. Another thing that I will add in addition to transparency is just more coordinated planning. With the energy world, there's so many different factors at play and different planning processes that utilities have to take at different scales. So there's like separate transmission planning from resource planning, from distribution planning, and since all of those tend to happen in silos and they aren't really speaking to each other, it's really hard to like know that we're planning for a future where we're accommodating all of these loads in a way that like really makes sense and is able to keep rates affordable and service reliable. And in addition to that, I think something that's also really important to consider is we talk a lot about energy consumption, but I also think reliability is also an issue when it comes to planning around data centers. There's some research that shows that it will have an impact or can have an impact on outages and the number of outages that happens, on just the quality of power that's being delivered, because it can impact like the frequency and the voltage of the power system. And so I think those things also should be taken into consideration, and so developing regulatory mechanisms that can help prevent those types of outages that can lead to more widespread effects. And then the last thing I'll say is really just involving communities in assessing what the benefits and costs are going to be. And so to some extent that can happen in the utility regulatory process, but that process is already very convoluted and quite difficult, especially if you don't have a legal or economic or engineering background. You tend to need someone to help guide you through that process. So I think having more open forums that are more catered towards just regular folks who don't have technical backgrounds, so that they can also have their opinions be heard in these venues.
Absolutely. No, I love that. And I think like the idea of like equipping, regular folks with the right tools is super important. And I think in a way like that's a big part of what Probable Future does, right? Like you help organizations understand and prepare for climate instability. So I know you've written about like climate mindsets and practical adaptation tools. And clearly we've sort of established this paradox where AI can be a great tool for sustainable usage, but it does have its own footprint. So I wonder, like, the question I have for you is, what do you think about sort of that paradox and contradiction, and like specifically, like, how should we move forward navigating that tension?
Yeah, I guess maybe to start off, I would say contradiction is a part of human life and human society. I mean, near Climate Week, tons of people fly in, and the carbon emissions that come from that, do they outweigh the benefits that come from collaborating in a single place? Like, I don't know. And so, especially those of us that work in climate or are thinking about climate in our day-to-day lives, like, that contradiction is gonna be there in everything we use, regardless of whether it's AI or another tool. The thing I would maybe center back on first is that, to what you described, the physical backbone of AI is data centers. And so when you're thinking about data centers as these things that have to stay within this really narrow band of temperature, and AI is putting a lot more computational pressure, so large models need to be trained. You're getting really computationally heavy chips. You're getting tons of requests that also are computationally heavy. All of that requires more energy, which produces more heat, which requires more cooling, and therefore needs more water. And so when all of those things combine, I think it's a little bit simplistic to assume that the only contradiction that we're experiencing is due to carbon emissions. These are not just things that are heating up the planet, but really lived experiences that people, especially in communities where data centers are located, are experiencing. I'll go back to what I said before, which is that I don't think the benefits or the cons of AI are predetermined. I think a lot of it will be around intention and how we parse through what actually matters to us and how we use it. But I would say it might be time to maybe question a lot of the assumptions we have around AI and data center development. Why do we need to use fossil fuel plants alongside data centers? Why can't we use renewable energy or battery storage? Why do they need to be placed in places that are water stressed, as you said previously? Why do we not account for communities and what communities might need in terms of like what other industries there are, how they might need to be resources shared, how wastewater management systems might need to expand in a local community to make room for all of the wastewater that's exiting out of a data center. All of these things, I think, in this rapid race for AI, we haven't really been considering. I think it's really just been build data center after data center. And by not really interrogating why we're doing the things we're doing, I think we're just having a lot of harms and we're missing some of that tension. I think ultimately that tension is good. I think we just haven't really been aware of it until recently, and I think it's only recently coming to light.
I'm like, just yes.
Yeah.
Everything you say, yes. And also, can I just co-op for a second? Can we also stop talking about climate as just carbon? Because the water piece, we live in California, guys. I don't know if you know this, we don't have a lot of water. I don't know if you've ever heard about that on the news. And the fact that we talk about the carbon journey and not the water journey when we think about the implications and the environmental implications of our technology, I think is negligent, because one of the things that I think about a lot, like this contradiction you're talking about, is just the fact that, it helps so much, and in my world of the water people, it's, filling in those resource gaps we have. There's not a lot of people working in water utilities right now, okay? Just gonna say that for a second. So they're really leaning on AI to fill in HR gaps that they have, but then it's also like, but they're also gonna have to produce more water they don't have to fill the HR gap. So it's like this really weird, like eating your tail kind of thing to feed yourself, because we're having this conversation about climate, and the energy piece too is also water, as we talked about, and there's just so many, like you said, like interrogation points where I feel like everyone's kind of like, great, we have solved some things, this is amazing, instead of really saying, oh, where is that coming from? Like, what are we gonna have to lose? And like you said, like, who pays for that?
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think like it's a great transition to sort of like this back half of the panel where like we've talked a lot about like the principles, but maybe like exploring more about like what practices, especially when it comes to things like justice, fairness, proof, and foresight. Maybe to get started with that, I'll turn it back to Jasmine. I see that you've had research that looks on how power systems can result in disparate or inequitable outcomes on different communities. And there is like, I think, a parallel emerging with data centers where they're being built disproportionately in black and brown neighborhoods that are already burdened by pollution. Earlier we were talking about an example in Memphis where Elon Musk has operated gas turbines without permits in predominantly black communities where cancer risk is already 4 times the national average. So I guess like from your research on energy justice, what parallels or patterns do you see as this like continues to unfold? And maybe like even looking ahead, like given that AI is relatively early in its life cycle compared to the power grid, do you think there's anything that can happen now to prevent the issue from getting worse in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So as I said in my opening remarks, I think that what's happening with AI is really just an exacerbation of patterns and systems that have already existed. And one way to think about that with data centers is, for example, with their diesel backup generation. So a lot of data centers rely on backup generation just to ensure the reliability to their consumers, right? Making sure that they're online 24/7. And in a lot of cases, not every case, you'll have data centers that have to have a lot of diesel generators that can turn on in an instant. But what that means for communities that are sited near those data centers is that when the power goes out or when like the grid itself maybe fails or there is some sort of outage, and they go rely on diesel generation, then that's a lot of pollution that's just immediately going out. And diesel is not, not a clean thing to want to breathe in. And so there is that source of pollution, and that's something that you can address with the Utility Commission. So if folks are interested in that type of issue, that would be a great place to kind of go for accountability on that. Another thing as well, as I mentioned earlier, is around just reliability and resilience. And so with particularly AI training, that has a very sensitive type of profile when it comes to energy. And so the intensity of AI training and also the way that it kind of ramps up really quickly in terms of the energy use means that it also has a big impact on the stability of the grid. And so what can happen is that if you ramp up the AI training all of a sudden and the grid can't quite accommodate that sudden increase in load, it can lead to cascading blackouts. And there have been instances where this has triggered a fault in the system, and there have been some blackouts that have happened. I think there was one in Virginia that happened earlier, maybe last year or so. And so I think also thinking about how we are using these data centers and really being careful about where they're also sited, I think is really important. And unfortunately, maybe fortunately, depending on who you are, a lot of these data centers end up being really concentrated, and a lot of them are sited near each other because they can reuse, the same infrastructure. They have a lot of redundancy in that area, but I think that comes to a cost, at a cost for the people who live around that. So thinking of Northern Virginia, thinking of the Phoenix area that is drawing both a lot of power and a lot of water to run those systems. And those are also places that are not cool, right? Those are very hot places that require extra energy for cooling, that require extra water to be cooled. They don't have a lot of water, at least Phoenix doesn't. So I think the siting issues are also really difficult, but that's also been something that is pervasive within the energy system itself. There have always been debates about where we're siting coal power plants, nuclear energy, nuclear waste, things like that. So I think we really have to contend with these trade-offs, and I think really get consent from communities, especially when we're thinking about data centers where you build one there and the rest will follow. So I think it's also thinking about what those longer term relationships might be between the people who live on a land and the folks who are gonna set up these infrastructures.
Cool, yeah. So, not big. Kind of continuing the thread on historical precedent or, projections, I'm a bit of an assumption, but given that probable future helps helps people prepare for projected climate change, I assume history is a pretty invaluable tool. Some say that AI is essentially the next industrial revolution, and historically industrial revolutions have greatly impacted our global environment. And given the projected scale, it seems likely AI is going to follow suit. So my questions for you are, does the projected adoption of AI play into how we think about climate change? Can we look at historical precedents in order to better inform like the level of climate impact we're thinking of, and if not, or maybe in addition to it, like how else do we go about understanding this projected AI impact?
Great, yeah, so I'm gonna do something a little bit unorthodox. I'm gonna run through a bunch of slides that basically gives us context into what our history of climate has been, so that way you can understand what's at stake when it comes to AI. So hopefully everyone can see this. So this is a graph of our average global temperature history. And the graph starts at 9,500 BCE when civilization first started, human civilization. And as you can see, for the next however many years, the Earth's temperature was relatively stable. It would alternate between 1 degree to -1 degree Celsius, but it was pretty much within this really stable green band of stability. If we look back further, we see that actually when humans first emerged in Africa, the climate was really unstable. So what you're seeing here is global average temperature fluctuating a lot. And so when humans first emerged around 200,000 BCE, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We had to move from place to place because you couldn't really settle in one place for a long time. And it wasn't until then that point when the climate stabilized that we had human civilization start to emerge. So the idea I'm really trying to get here is that a stable climate basically underpins all of civilization. It gave us the ability to settle down, to create communities, to have cultures, to build governments, to have infrastructure, to have industry, and to specialize, because we knew we were going to stay in that place for a long time and we could count on it staying relatively the same. And so if you look at what's coming ahead, we've now exited that green band of stability. We're now at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is outside of any time that modern human civilization has existed. And so when we really think about what that means, we're seeing basically the fundamentals of a stable climate start to break down. And when that starts to break down, you have all of these other elements that depend on it start to teeter. So what does that mean for AI? I think there's two things here. One, more existentially, for AI to thrive, we need a stable society and we also need a livable planet. More practically, a lot of the AI industry right now, and you can think of this as data centers, our supply chains, our chip making, does not think about climate. They don't think about the risks that they're contributing to, and they also don't think about the risks that are impacting them directly. Here's a map of the American Southwest. This is a probable futures map. Everything is free online from our site, but this, the reason I bring up this map is, again, because a lot of planned and future AI data centers are in this region, from Arizona to Texas to Nevada to parts of California and even parts of Oregon. This is a map of what the likelihood of extreme drought was back in 1800, so at a climate that doesn't exist anymore, 0.5 degrees of Celsius. And as you can see right here, even though these areas are water stressed, the likelihood of drought is actually really low. So there was enough water to go around for mostly everyone. This is where we are today. So as you can see right now, we're at 1.5 degrees Celsius. The likelihood of extreme drought has increased upwards of almost 20% in some places and even higher in others. And so you have all of these data centers that are in this place, and water is already becoming more and more limited due to drought increasing. And there's not enough water that's going to already go around for people, for communities, for agriculture, for industries, and also for the data centers that rely on this water in order to function. And again, from what a lot of my panelists have said, data centers have to stay in a certain band of temperature or else they shut down. So you have to keep them cool. And that means if water ever runs out, if energy ever runs out, you lose a bunch of data and you lose a bunch of money, frankly, for a lot of these AI companies as well. And then this is our proposed future right now. This is 3 degrees of warming, very much the pathway that we're currently on because carbon emissions haven't decreased. And with AI data centers and just our general need for energy, I think it's hard pressed unless we make some radical changes to get off this path. The reason I bring this up is not to be doomsday, but because this future is still avoidable. We don't have to go down this, but I think AI data centers are going to play a crucial role in whether this happens or not. And I think from both ends, if AI data centers can reduce their carbon emissions, they also avoid this reality for themselves, because this not only impacts the communities that they operate in, but it also impacts their direct operations. If you don't have enough water, you can't build a data center. And right now, most of these data centers are located in this region. So my question, or my answer to you after running through all these slides is basically that I think we like to think of AI as not connected to the physical world, but the reality is it is very much so. A lot of how AI functions, a lot of the resources it uses comes from the natural world. And when you're not thinking about where data centers are built, how they function, how they operate, how much emissions they're like emitting, all of this is gonna come back to affect them ultimately.
Wow.
So I hope this is.
No, that's, I don't know, very eye-opening, and can't argue with the numbers. I think, you know, as you were saying, like, I think what's really interesting is like, how you aren't framing it as a doomsday thing, like it is something that is avoidable. And I think that sort of requires, in a sense, like those who are most likely to be affected to be empowered to use tools like that. Maybe Kim, I'll turn it over to you now. Like, I know you've worked in over 50 countries on water access for underserved population, and you've also audited Fortune 500 companies on their water stewardship. And like that sort of makes me think of a story. We've talked about Arizona a couple times. It's a water scarce region, and there's a story about how Google initially negotiated a water rate of $6 per 1,000 gallons, while residents had to pay closer to 11. But eventually the community pushed back, and it led to Google switching to air cooling. So I guess like I say all that because I have questions around like when you look at cases like this through your environmental justice lens, what does fair look like? And is it as simple as having water scarce regions banning water intensive data centers? Or are there models where companies are genuinely partnering with communities for approval rather than purely extracting from them?
Such easy questions you're asking, aren't you? I think there's a lot going on in the idea of fairness. I think, to Jasmine's point earlier, like, you gotta bring the communities involved, like, from the get-go, because all of these AI centers have incredible reputational risks, right? Like that thing that happened in Arizona. There was a lawsuit that happened in Oregon recently about data centers for Google because the Native community felt like their water rights were being impinged on. So I think there's a lot of conversation about having these conversations from the jump. But I also feel like there's this trade-off conversation, again, that Jasmine was talking about that I resonate with, because, you know, first of all, efficient, we were talking about this before the talk, right? About like, it's almost like an afterthought sometimes to like think about fairness and to think about how to do this in a just and like environmentally friendly way, and that someone else is going to figure it out. Like there's another adult level that needs to happen, but it's like, we're the adults, like surprise, like we're the adults here. We all like have cars and, you know, loans and credits and all of that stuff. And we're the adults that are supposed to figure it out, but it's like everyone's kind of apprehensive to make that jump. And there was a study done by the Alliance for Water Stewardship recently. It was published about a month ago that was talking about the cost of inaction about this stuff in fairness, and said that the cost of inaction was 5 times higher than actually the cost of addressing some of these fairness questions, right? Because you have people in Mesa, Arizona who are mad. You have Arizona, you know, or Oregon putting out lawsuits. You have countries like Chile and Uruguay who are actually having full blast protests about this. And while we are having this conversation about, you know, the opportunities of AI, at the end of the day, it's also those communities that they're affecting, right? Like, why do we have data centers really close to a place that like, I'm like, oh my God, where do I start? So like in certain states, they sell you water by parcel of land, even though they don't necessarily have it, right? So there's this conversation about fairness. So if you buy this big hunk of land and build a data center on it, you get a whole lot of water allocation, even though the groundwater technically is for the native community. I'm thinking about Arizona and Nevada right now. That might be just too bad because you bought this parcel of land and you own it, so you have this water right. And there's this question again, like what I was saying at the very beginning, of like these tiers of understanding, these tiers of institutions that have to make some changes. You know, also the people, you know, here, I'm sure there's people here working at data centers. I mean, we're all in these conversations, but it's a different thing when you get to the office and you're just trying to like plug your numbers. So this idea of fairness becomes kind of like a cognitive dissonance that happens of like, well, I'm just doing my job instead of thinking about the communities you're affecting. And in Georgia right now, there are people whose wells have dried up because Google has implemented something. And really it is this conversation of, were they actually involved in a conversation at all? Or was it just that they came in with some like fanfare, got some politicians to agree to give them some land, and now the wells are drying up and people are going, well, wait a minute. And like we've all kind of talked about this already, is this conversation of bringing people in first, but also having these tension conversations and interrogating, and I really am enjoying that word, interrogating, so thank you for that. Interrogating ourselves about like, what are we doing? And under, it makes sense that we put data centers in places with large pieces of land, with a lot of heat and sun, but also, do we need to use places that are so water resource scarce? And the other thing too is you had mentioned that they have the air cooling systems are not as efficient as water cooling systems, so the adoption for better innovations is really scattered and inconsistent, because the innovations we have right now aren't very compelling for a lot of companies. And then I go back to my water utility people and ask them, what are they doing about it? And I go, well, the Googles are figuring it out, so we're fine. They'll figure it out. Again, it's that conversation of waiting for some other adult to kind of do that work and having that interrogation. I don't know if I quite answered your question. I went on a tangent, but that was it.
I thought it was great.
Great.
Yeah. I don't know. I saw a lot of nods. If anyone had anything they wanted to add, no pressure, of course.
I guess I'll just add one thing. I think about like planning for the future. I think one thing that's been really difficult with data centers, and I don't know if it's similar with water, but so much of well, basically, when you have a large load like a data center that wants to interconnect into the grid and access that power, it has to enter into this like queue, and there's now a lot of uncertainty as to like what the future of data center growth is going to be, because what basically these companies will do is they'll try and hold a spot in their line, even if they're not 100% sure that they want to put a data center in a place. So basically, the estimates we have now are very speculative. We don't actually know, and so that makes planning so much harder. So if you're a utility regulator or a utility trying to say like, I want to get this much energy to make sure my consumers have reliable power for the next 3 years, but then you don't actually have a good sense of like how much data centers are going to pop up in your region, then you can't really plan. So I think that's another thing too, is like we don't have a good sense of like what's going to come in the future, because I think we're also using these regulatory or these planning tools just to hold our places in the line, and then we pull the project. So I think it's also like maybe that part of that is happening because then the community finds out and then they push back against that development, but it's like maybe you should have gotten their consent first before you entered the queue. So I think there's also like an order of things that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
I wish that existed in water. It doesn't. I mean, yeah, like everything. I mean, I don't know if you've heard about like the whole Colorado River Basin, but like they just realized that their math wasn't mathing. And they're all like, oh, we made some calculations that were incorrect. And so that's kind of like the whole water sector at the moment in the US, where everyone's like, oh, we thought we had a lot of water. And one thing too, to like this point about queuing and like projections about water, and I do talk about water a lot, so I thank everyone for your patience. The west of the Mississippi, the water literacy is much higher. So I lived on New York City side, I lived in San Francisco side. The water literacy on the east side of the Mississippi is really low, and I still go over there a lot. And every time I do, and I talk to the water professionals and the utility guys and the people who work for the state about their concerns about water scarcity. Oh, you have a lot of data centers coming in. Like, what are you doing about that? Oh, it's never been a problem, so we're not worried. Because they're always looking at back data. They're looking at data from 2000, which no longer makes sense, but that's what they do. And that's really problematic. And so that's why I'm like, I never want to put all the blame on the data centers, because it's not just them. It's like the whole, everyone in this culture is just kind of not doing all of their parts.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, like, there's so many moments in which you look at these maps or you look at the data forward-looking, and you sort of question, why did no one see this coming? Why did no one see the fact that these places were going to get really hot, that water stress was going to be really high? Why didn't we build data centers in other places? But I do think it's a symptom of stability that we've been so privilege to have for so long that we've never really had to be like, oh, the conditions or the assumptions that we've built upon are going to change. And when you don't take into account the fact that your understanding of the world is based on a prior image of the world, then you can never really account for what the future is going to look like, or how the future is actually going to be very different compared to the past.
Yeah, 100%.
No, that was, yeah, great discussion. I mean, maybe, so I guess like just a heads up, we're gonna turn it over to Q&A after I ask Eric a last question to close us out. I think like we've been talking a lot about like how requiring like, substantial change would require like effective partnerships in a sense. And in a way, like I think Digital Green and Farmer Chat are a great example of a really effective partnership. Like you've achieved something really remarkable. Essentially you're reducing agricultural extension costs from $35 per farmer to 35 cents per farmer through AI, while serving 8.2 million. And that's a 100-fold cost improvement, delivering real climate adaptation for, vulnerable smallholder farmers in various areas you've mentioned. So I guess like when it's your turn to sort of like communicate these results, whether it's to funders or skeptics, how do you make the case that like your specific AI application is justifying its environmental footprint, and what metrics specifically do you think matter most in proving that certain AI use cases are genuinely worth their water or energy costs?
Yeah, I guess it's shifting gears a bit from data centers because we don't think about that whatsoever, unfortunately. We're on the exact opposite side of the wires and pipes on that.
Yeah.
There's a really easy two-part answer to the question, and I'll go for a little bit longer one. But the easier two-part is we don't talk to the skeptics, and then those who ask those questions don't fund us. The longer questions and the longer answer on this situation is that nobody asks those questions because they don't know how to ask those questions. I mean, to all the data points that you're talking about, the maps that you're showing, things like that, even on the AI side of things, at least the folks that we partner with, care about the end result for that individual in another country on a farm. They'll get at the climate aspect, which I can touch on in a second, but they care about tangibly the livelihood, the impact, the income that a given technology or a given intervention can have on them. We do have a number of funders that are starting to push more for a climate-smart agricultural adaptation, certainly not mitigation by any means. And what that tends to look like is basically two big avenues for that. One is water reduction. I feel like you'd be really happy about that. That is less use of irrigation, or better use of irrigation and less water use is a significant driver and kind of component of some climate for agriculture. And then also reduce fertilizer usage, which is actually a harder one to get across because typically when you say use less fertilizer, you go, well, when I grow less crops, not if you're already using too much and burning your crops. Those are kind of the two biggest drivers of climate smart agriculture, which take generations of thinking to undo in terms of that adoption of those practices. So on the climate side of things, that's where we are in terms of practice. However, we don't have any measurement of that at any kind of aggregate scale. We can go out and ask every single individual farmer or do a kind of a randomized sample on that. Water use is incredibly hard to measure because typically it's like, oh, well, I got 4 buckets from the river yesterday and dumped it on my paddy field. Or I bought 1 less bag last week, but I think rats ate half of it. I lost part of it when the donkey cart fell over or something like that. So getting to that kind of measurement is really challenging. So funders don't even ask for that kind of thing, let alone anything further up the stream in terms of what is the actual carbon, water, energy usage of all the AI that you're using. The best proxy that we have for that is cost. To serve a farmer, cost to get to that adoption of an adapted climate smart agricultural practice, which is both beneficial, of course, for organizational sustainability, serving the farmers and kind of the best use of funder money, but also the best use of the tech stack that we have. So we've taken a lot of steps over the past 2 years to effectively reduce our reliance on using large language models, query-intensive tech stacks, even reliance on the big AI tech companies for a lot of different reasons, one of which is better serving these unique conditions. And we've done that in a couple of different ways. One is small language models that could potentially run on a farmer's phone. That's still pretty tricky to do unless you have millions and millions of dollars and a lot of top-tier AI engineers. We have offline modes, which are really tricky as well because then they kind of have a cache preset standardized set of questions that don't adapt nearly as well to farmers. And if farmers are probably more skeptical of AI than we are, which I really appreciate. Because they're like, what is this nonsense technology that it seems like a magic box? I trust my farmer next door who's been doing this practice for a decade or two. So if you lose their trust early on, it's never coming back, whether or not the technology application is beneficial for them or not. The last thing is we've also tried, at least on the climate smart agricultural practice measurement side of things, we tried a number of MRV studies to measure the carbon output of change practices. And the first, second, third study we did, basically everyone had the wrong methodology, the numbers were wrong, inaccurate, the sample size was too small, it didn't apply to that field over there, just everything was wrong with it. And that's not necessarily a reflection of those who did the work on that, just a reflection of the state of the industry to be able to measure those kind of things. So again, best proxy that we have is getting to that reduced costs. But the real, the trick of all of this is that all these questions that are being raised here and all these very valid points is that nobody's asking those questions at the funding level. What about the water usage? What about when it's like 10 to 20 years? Can you point to specifically which data center this query is coming from or anything like that? Which is a shame. It's not pointing the finger back at the funders, but those questions are so hard they don't want to ask them.
Cool. I don't know if anyone up here has any last thoughts. Otherwise, we can turn it over to Q&A.
Awesome. Just start raising your hand. You can do it without a mic, but we also have a mic ready if you want to use it. Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation. You talked a lot about the situation in America, but I'm wondering if any of you know if maybe there's more innovation in terms of managing the impact of these data centers in places like China or India or other countries.
What I know is that a lot of these data centers are managed by the same companies and corporations, and they tend to have corporate standards globally. And so the data centers that I've seen have told me that it's a similar approach that they have in other countries as well. I would say the only differences might be in their grid requirements and what's available. I would say one of the things that's interesting in some places, other than OECD countries like the US, Europe, and Australia, and all those places, a lot of the countries that have emerged in markets in the last 20, 30 years have kind of leapfrogged in some ways, in some sense, not all of them. So there is more opportunity for better innovation in some of those places, but I haven't seen anything pop up on my end particularly remarkable. I don't know if you guys have seen it.
I can share maybe one very specific example, and I just learned about this, but in, I believe, France and Denmark, there are regulations at the power system level that help maintain the stability and kind of reliability of the system that basically requires that if a data center loses load really quickly, that they, I think they have to have certain mechanisms in place, or I think if there's a grid disturbance, then they have to maintain their load just long enough to maintain the frequency, and so I think there's different things that I don't quite understand in the specifics of the regulation, but I've seen that, and I think that's actually being considered right now in Texas, but they haven't approved that regulation.
I think a similar story in Denmark is, especially Copenhagen, I think you have sometimes these cities that are really well planned and designed, and so they have a whole underground system of transferring heat. So what that means is excess heat from power plants or data centers that comes out actually doesn't just get released or continue to exist. That's actually funneled back into people's homes that they can use to power their homes or to warm up their homes. And then places in which there is cool air then gets funneled into those places that need it. So I think when you have really well-designed systems that can move around the inputs and outputs of data centers, I think those are, I would say, probably the best models that I know of so far.
I know from the energy drawing standpoint, some of our partners in India, Kenya, Ethiopia don't want to rely on some of the big tech companies from the Western world. So they're actually kind of saying no in some cases where they can, but also building out their own data centers and even their own LLM or even small language models for specific geographic bounds, which helps with more cultural knowledge, speaking to kind of the value set, better language capabilities without having to add extra layers of translation that require data energy usage from there. They also have very different grid and utility capabilities and makeups to begin with, so they're much more factoring that into how they're building those.
Cool. That's awesome. Anyone else have a question for any of our panelists?
Sure, thanks everybody, this has been fantastic. I wanted to ask about some practical steps of actions. You know, say if you had a magic wand and you could grant one or two things to happen in the sector to improve the situation of AI on the environment, what would that be? I mean, we talked some about water, looking at water resources management. We talked some about maybe building data centers in other places, but I would just love to hear a little bit more from you on what we can do, and maybe not only what data companies can do, because it's easy to blame them as well, but yeah, curious about practical next steps. Thank you.
I can start. Okay, so yeah, going back to energy, I guess I do think that one area that is hopeful is, there is a lot of conversations about the negative impact energy-wise of data centers, but I think one area they can help is, they have all of these backup power systems that they rely on for their own reliability, but you can kind of use some of that same technology to actually provide services back to the grid, so making the grid more reliable and resilient. And so if the batteries are able to give power back to the grid and not just be for backup power, I think one thing that would be great is, if there's a power outage, maybe there's like a capacity shortfall or something like that, the data center can actually help by providing some energy back. So there's sort of that capability, and some other things that I think are happening on a smaller scale, but Google is doing some pilots, is also like really using AI to actually time when they're doing certain types of like computationally intensive activities around when like renewables are being used. So I think like showing more support, or like going to your utility regulator to like advocate for more of those types of programs that are like really maybe leveraging AI or other technologies to make sure that like when the sun is out, we're doing the AI training that we need to do and things like that. So I think that's definitely something hopeful.
Yeah, I think from the mitigation side, I think some data centers are doing this, but when you build a data center, you can have a power purchase agreement, which is directly tied to like the building of a renewable energy project. So those two go hand in hand. And I think especially with the current administration and its sort of negative take on renewables, I think that's a way actually to get those projects online, because there's a assured buyer for renewable energy. I think from the adaptation side, you have like a list of things you can do. You can be just aware of where you're building, and you can place your data centers accordingly where those impacts are probably going to be the least, and where most likely the data center will also exist and be operational for a long time. I think from a water perspective, instead of like evaporative cooling, you can shift over to coolants or using reclaimed wastewater, which some data centers do, but obviously just is more expensive, so I think just requires trade-offs there. I think from a individual user AI perspective, I would say maybe question when you need the latest, most expensive model. Obviously that varies a lot depending on the use case, and it's nice to use the most current model for things, but often the smaller and earlier models are usually less computationally intensive. And so those might be one way in which you are trying to lower your own carbon footprint of some kind. You could switch over to that.
Yeah, just building on the model building side of things, if you will. Instead of one giant model that tries to do everything, smaller models are less energy intensive. So if you can we have visions of a network of smaller, more decentralized language models that are then connected together by MCPs or by LoRa connectors or other technical pieces. You're not having one giant behemoth. You think about the Titanic, right? It's crashing the iceberg. It's a smaller flotilla of boats that can better navigate more turbulent waters. But coming back to our analogy of things, it draws down less on energy consumption.
I still think anyone who wants to do a really cool thing, make that little Chrome extension that calculates your AI consumption and tell you how thirsty you are would be really cool. But I'm also a really big fan of regulation. I think regulation's a really key way to ensure environmental safety and health. And I think that, you know, my partner is a data privacy lawyer, so I get to hear a lot about all of the AI ruminations and litigation at the moment, and nothing's quite formalized, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity, even like in the water utilities, to start putting ceilings on like how much water you're allocated in a day and stuff like that, just to get the ball rolling, and that could help with other industries as well. And that makes them, you know, think about more efficiencies, take on those better innovations. And then regulations eventually, hopefully, will also start thinking about like the ethical, like trade-offs on the environmental piece.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we have time for one last question.
Oh, I don't need a microphone, I'm fine. I've heard a lot about energy and water, and it's very relevant. But one thing I haven't heard a lot about, and I'd ask you to speak on a little bit, is the consumption of rare earth metals and rare earth elements in AI. Could I hear a little bit about concerns you may or may not have about how these data centers are consuming a finite resource, rare earth elements?
Yeah, so that's a whole nother can of worms that we didn't even get into. But I think I can start with just some of my understanding on it. So I think the newer chips are much more resource intensive. And I mean, not only from like an energy consumption side, but usually to make that really highly precise technology, you have to use a degree of water that's even more purified than fresh water.
It's called ultra pure.
Ultra pure, yeah, that's great branding. So, and so a certain amount of fresh water is then turned into ultra pure water, but a lot of that actually is wastewater. So I think you can only use like 2/3 of fresh water into ultra pure. And then, so you already are using like tons of water to produce these chips, and then there's obviously the rare earth minerals and other substances that are being used to develop these things. Then there's the transportation of all of those chips to the places in which they're being used. And then there's all of the wiring and everything else that also goes in. So I don't really have a solution for that. I think unfortunately it's kind of the era that we're in which there's just like large demand for technology and data. And so I can't see those minerals or that demand drying out anytime soon, but I don't know.
I mean, the other question too is like, where is it coming from, right? So it's usually from like the DRC, which is notoriously ripe with conflict because of all of this and all of the extraction that's happening. I think there could be an opportunity. I'm not saying this is also not my wheelhouse, but there's also a really interesting opportunity that we see in other industries that are extractive, like in diamonds, where like we started doing things like tracking where sourced materials are coming from, so they have to have like certifications of sourcing fairly as well. And I think that could also help address some of these environmental things kind of in a secondary way, but I don't see anyone doing that because I don't know if they're thinking about it much. I think supply chain, you know, the key for supply chain is cost effectiveness, and a lot of the times the other things you might, one of the things I see in my auditing sometimes is these large companies that have data centers and do chips, you know, they'll put out a supply chain email and say, please fill out this survey. And then you have 70,000 surveys that are filled out, and then someone says, oh, these are the top 5%, and this is like our, you know, they don't go into the deep end necessarily. So I think that there's a lot to be done there, but it's also, like you were saying, really gnarly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll also add, like, that even if we, you know, solve the energy problem, we're like, okay, everything's going to be solar energy, and we're going to only rely on batteries and solar and wind. Like, particularly with batteries and solar, we still need to mine for those like extractive, you know, those minerals that are really extractive to get. And so I think like this really brings me back to like the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, in that order, right? I think if we're really going to address this problem and feel like okay about our impact on the earth, we have to first reduce our demand, right? So I think that comes back to like, do we really need AI for everything? Like, there are a lot of things that I have now that all of a sudden, like in the next software update, just like give me AI, but I never asked for it, and I also don't feel like I need it. Like my door